Talking about something and related to the Parsha of the week. And this week it's a double header. It's ending the book of Bamidbar. And there are several topics that get discussed. One starts off talking about vows and obligations, and it goes on talking about the war on Midian and how to divide things up properly. And then it goes on to talking about how Reuben and Gad want land that's east of the Jordan River, but are asked then to participate in the conquering of the main land of Israel, and talks about the borders of Israel and all the routes we stopped at when we left Eretz Mitzrayim to the Holy Land. And so there are a lot of sort of unrelated topics that are sort of tied together in these two parts, and people spend a lot of time trying to interrelate them, and I couldn't actually follow the commentary very well on those who tried to intertwine them together and find some common theme. They couldn't convince me, at least. But so I thought instead I would just talk about one of the subjects that was raised in this, and that was the first one, talking about vows and obligations. And I don't know. I'm not a really well-read student of the Torah. I mean, I read now and then, but especially on Shabbat. But I do know a bit about business, and so I thought I would take this topic of vows and obligations and try to relate it to what we do as business leaders, or what we probably should be doing as business leaders if we're not doing them already. And so when it talks about the vows and obligations, it starts off by basically saying Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes. And people have interpreted this to mean either he was talking to the people in general about the leaders of the tribes, or he's talking to the leaders of the tribes specifically. And there's some discussion about what's really going on. I tend to believe that he's talking more to the people and talking about the responsibilities of the leaders, because he spends a lot of time. So it's talked a lot. So I'll just go on and read a few of the parts in English, and then so you get the gist of what's being talked about, and then I'll go into how it relates, I think, to the business world. So just to read literally, if a man makes a vow to the Lord or makes an oath to prohibit himself, he shall not violate his word. According to whatever came out of his mouth, he shall do. So he's commanded to live up to his vow and his obligation. Then it starts talking about women. If a woman makes a vow to the Lord or imposes a prohibition upon herself while in her father's house in her youth, or if her father heard her vow or prohibition which she has prohibited her upon herself, yet her father remains silent, all her vows shall stand, and any prohibition that she has imposed upon herself shall stand. And it goes on, and it spends a lot of time talking about obligations and vows that are made by a man and then by a woman, and which ones a woman when she makes it, are imposed upon the man, the father or the husband in some cases. And so the commentators have spent time talking about what this is really talking about, and most things I've read seem to conclude it's talking a lot about what happens according to the transition of two persons being single when they come together as being married, and what happens in terms of their vows and obligations to each other, as well as the community as that union starts to form. I'm not going to talk about marriage. I'm not an expert in it. But I will talk a bit about business and how I think vows and commitments and obligations, and they're all three different, by the way, relate to the business world. So as I said earlier, I really like to, I think there are three trains of thought, at least that I've read about, when it comes to talking about who's actually being talked to and who's actually supposed to be following these instructions. And the most logical interpretation that's been talked about is he's actually talking to the leaders of all the tribes, so that they will actually lead by example and propagate these teachings among the general population of each of their tribes. Others have interpreted this to mean he's actually telling the leaders because it's known that they make the most promises and they have the most vows and obligations to their tribes and of course the people who are they're leading. And that, of course, has a lot of relevance to the business world, where leaders, whether you're an executive or whether you're on the executive staff, you have a lot of vows and obligations, more so than the rank and file workers in your company. And then the final one, as interpreted, is one I think I like the most, is that it's actually delivering the message to the Israelites, and he's telling them, but he's talking about what are the obligations of the leadership, of their leaders, and what they should expect from them, and how they should live up to their vows and obligations. But I think actually the last two are a bit intertwined, and I'd like to spend sort of the rest of whatever time I'm talking discussing those things and how they relate to the business world. So when I think about commitments and responsibilities and vows we make in the business world, I put them like into three different buckets, and there maybe is a fourth I can talk about later. So in no special order, we make vows and commitments to our shareholders and our investors. So if you're a startup, you go in and you make certain promises and certain proposals, if you will, to a set of investors. And if they believe you and they like what you're talking about, and they like the market and a whole bunch of other factors, they may actually invest in you. If they've already invested in you, then they certainly expect that you're going to be entrusted with certain obligations to them. They've given you money, they've given you some backing, they've given you whatever, and they're expecting a whole bunch in return. Besides, ultimately, of course, a financial return on their investment, but there are all kinds of things that they expect during the interim, before that financial return comes, that they expect you as the leader or executive of the corporation to provide them. The second bucket of vows and obligations I think we all have are those to our employees. When we hire someone, we make an offer to someone, they come join the company, we basically entered into, you entered in some cases a formal agreement, in most cases not. But you do have an informal agreement. You have an informal agreement to treat them a certain way. They have an informal agreement to do their best at their job, and it's a two-way street. And I'll talk about more details about that relationship. And the third one, of course, is our customers. And I'll spend a lot more time talking about that because, in my opinion, that's the most important relationship you have in a company. And everybody in a company has a relationship with their customers. In most cases, they're indirect relationships. You're testing a product, you're designing a product, you're thinking about the product on behalf of your customers. And only typically the salespeople, if there's a sales force involved, actually has that direct relationship with the customer. The rest of us have an indirect relationship with the customer, but we all have obligations to the customer. And because ultimately it's the customer who pays the bills indirectly, it is inevitably the most important relationship. And every company treats that relationship differently. And I'll try to give some examples from my experience, and I'm sure all of us have other experiences that relate to these things. So let me start in the order I listed them, and then I'll go through some things. And if you have something to say on the subject, just go ahead and say it. I'm not going to care. So in case of investors and shareholders, typically in the beginning of a high-tech company, which is I think the basis of what we're mostly talking about here, they're often one and the same thing. The investors will put money into a corporation, and they become the principal shareholders in the corporation as well. And later in time, if things go well and it's a publicly traded company, to a less extent, the shareholders or investors, sure, they own a portion of the corporation of a publicly traded corporation, but they're not investors able to direct or try to guide how the money's invested. They're actually more passive because there are just many more of them. Every now and then, a shareholder buys a large portion of ownership of a company and tries to become more active. Many of you have heard of Carl Icahn. He's a notorious, or depending whether you're a friend or an enemy with him, he's had a big reputation for becoming a shareholder, then an investor, and then trying to do what he can to influence a corporation. Not always in the best interest of the company, by the way. In fact, I would say in his specific case, it's in the best interest of the shareholders, but it's not in the best interest of the company or the customers or the employees, which is a problem. So let's talk about investors and shareholders for a minute. So when we secure funding in the beginning of a company, we make certain promises. We say we're going to use this money in a certain way, and with that money we intend to prove certain things to the investors. Perhaps that's we're going to get a certain level of number of customers. We're going to be able to show we can get revenue. We can show we can create a product that does this, this, and that. And overall, they expect us to live up to those obligations. They gave us money for that reason, and they certainly expect us to, as best we can, to live up to those obligations. But ultimately, what are we really promising the investor? Because most investors, honestly, don't really care if you live to the letter of their obligations. Okay? If you told them you're going to have this product done on this date, and you'll be able to show that a certain number of customers are using it in a certain way on that date, the honest truth is most investors honestly don't care if instead you show them a different product that maybe is in the same category with a different set of customers, as long as either path lead to a final belief that you will be able to generate money and therefore value for the company. And so the real focus and the real tacit understanding you have with the investors is that you're here to create value. And that's what's expected. I got this lesson very early on in my career from actually some very smart venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who really told me in numerous ways, on numerous occasions, that the real goal of the entrepreneur is to create value. That, in a nutshell, is what it's all about. Because if you create value, then people, customers, will want to pay for that value in whatever form it takes. And so the whole goal here is to take money, which of course has value, from these investors and transform it into something that has much greater value. And that is the underlying vow and commitment you're making with your investors and shareholders, that you're going to undertake the task through your own energy, your own innovation, your own creativity, through your own intelligence, and for the people that work with you on the project, you're going to go create more value. And that's, in essence, what's really all about. And I wrote down here, I'm a chemist by trade, so it's a little bit like alchemy. And if you remember the alchemists, they're the ones who could turn anything into gold. That was their whole quest in life. And in many respects, that's what entrepreneurs are all about, alchemy. You're there to take something from nothing and to create value where it didn't exist before. And that's ultimately I would say the underlying contract you have with your investors and your shareholders. Along the way, you also have other commitments you make. You commit to be financially responsible. You commit to report your status honestly and frequently. That's what investors expect. And often they think that they know more than you, and you're required to listen to their fine words of wisdom and to follow those that you think are worthy of following and ignore the others. And that's, at least from my experience, then of course you have to spend their money wisely and conservatively. And that's of course difficult to do. But I think if we as entrepreneurs or as people who either are leaders or hope to be leaders of companies, if we focus on this basic principle of value creation, and by the way, it doesn't apply just to companies or companies for profit. Nonprofits also have to create value. You're creating a benefit for your customers, which are often the beneficiaries of your Amutah. And it may not be a for-profit enterprise, but it's still all about creating value. And creating value, at least for new companies, where it didn't exist before. So if I can import that and have that stick in your mind, then I've done a good deed for the day. The other category of, when I think about commitments and responsibilities in the business world, there's those with employees. I've seen circumstances here in Israel and also in the United States where some things get done that aren't very, I'll use the word right, maybe ethical is a different word. People get hired when there's really no money to pay them with, but on a promise that they're told they're going to be paid. I think it's a little, not only stretching the truth, I think it's really unwise to do that with people. and I see it done. But I think when you hire people and they come under your employment, you undertake a certain obligation to them, and of course they have an obligation to you. I think in the category of your obligation to them is you obviously have an obligation to compensate them fairly. And fairly means a lot of different things. What's fair in a company like Amdocs or Checkpoint is very different from what's fair to a three-man startup or three-woman startup. And so what's fair is typically what's the marketplace, goes on in the marketplace. And so you have an obligation to compensate them fairly, of course, and provide them competitive benefits. I think these are obvious to all of us. What's not obvious to all of us is there are other obligations I think you undertake when you hire people. And in many cases, you take an obligation to invest in them. So you're not only investing money to build your business, you're investing in your employees, because if you don't, you're not going to be building your business. Okay? Because ultimately, it's people that make companies work. And if you're not willing to invest in them by getting them trained and cross-trained and to help them along, and there are times, for example, when tragedy hits their family and things unexpected happen and they need some patience and some assistance perhaps from you, their employer, to get through a difficult time. It was interesting. Once I was interviewing for a job at Hewlett-Packard. This was in the era of Hewlett-Packard when Hewlett-Packard was Hewlett-Packard. And this is maybe 1984, 85? No. Yeah, about 85. Yeah, about 1985, 86. And it was for it was like a director role at the company. I would have been, if I had gotten the job, which I didn't. I'll tell you why I didn't get the job in a second. I would have been managing an organization of around 60 people that were all doing certain kinds of microchips. It was a very profitable part of the company. And actually, it still is a very profitable part of the company, but it's no longer HP. It's called Agilent today. And during the interview process, I was asked if an employee was coming to work, not necessarily even every day, but coming to work and showing, and they'd previously shown that they were very good workers and did a good job, but all of a sudden, and consistently over more than a 2-month period of time, their productivity and their work deteriorated pretty dramatically. What would you do? So it was really an excellent question, and I had never been asked it before. And I had been managing at that stage, but never. At Xerox before I was really an individual contributor. I wasn't a manager. And then I went to a startup where you really don't learn how to become a manager, except what you learn on your own. No one trains you to be anything. And then I started interviewing this job at HP. And so I don't remember exactly what I said. It was sort of along the lines, well, I would sit down with the employee, and I would try to ask them, what's wrong, and try to understand if it's something that deserves my attention or not. And I was informed 2 weeks later that I didn't get the job. And then when I asked why, that was because I didn't answer that question properly the HP way. And the HP way, at least in those days, was going way beyond what I had just said. In other words, they expected their managers, and by the way, I would have to say that every Silicon Valley company followed in the footsteps of Hewlett-Packard, and the Hewlett-Packard tradition. Apple and everything that came after it, in the beginning tried to emulate many things of Hewlett-Packard, and they really set the standard in the industry for how you deal with high tech, how you deal with employees, and so on. And I was told that actually the right answer was something along the lines, well, you not only sit down with them and try to find out what's bothering them, you ask how you can help, what you should be doing to help them, and should the company be finding resources to put at their disposal, and so on. And when I gave my original response, I also said something to the effect, well, and then after 2 or 3 weeks, if you don't see progress, you have to put them on some kind of program where if they don't show improvement, that they could potentially lose their job. And that was definitely not the HP way. And so I learned that sort of a very painful lesson. So I think, from what I learned from working in the Valley, that employers, when they hire employees, have an obligation to not only treat them fairly, but also to invest in them and help them grow. And the goal along goes, it would help them develop their careers. And so when I hire people today, I always want to know what they want to do in their life, where they want to be, how they want to grow, so I can think through my own way, am I going to be able to help? Or do I expect my staff to help them? And I think in my career, I reached the point where, and this is very important if you really want to manage and lead people, is, and I learned this, I think, I don't remember where I learned this from, maybe on my own, that I found the most satisfying experiences in my work life evolved over time, from making something happen to the point where I see someone happen. And so let me give you another example of what I mean by that. I was a senior VP of engineering and operations at a company called KitThere. It was a startup. We led the whole travel booking world at the time of the internet. We were the first to have a travel booking site. And our specialty was in corporate travel. We actually also hosted all the major airline websites, long before Travelocity and Expedia. And we were doing, I would say we had a lot of problems. I'd say particularly in the growth, and we actually had to cut back my staff and grow it again for a variety of reasons. And I would say 6 months after I arrived, we filled out the rest of the executive team on the company, and we were having some challenges in what I call our IS department. So this is the group of people who actually go around and manage all their desktop computers and the Exchange servers, the email, all this stuff for companies. And so that group asked to work for me because they wanted to be close to engineering rather than, sometimes they work for the financial department, sometimes not. And I inherited a couple members of that team, and the person I put in charge of was a woman. And she was having some troubles growing with the job, is how I would put it. And the team was falling apart, and I was in an executive meeting where I was being asked by my co-executives not to fire her or to sort of encourage her to leave, but they thought I should hire someone to supervise her. And I put my foot down and told everyone in very clear terms that that wasn't going to happen. That I looked around the table at the time, and there was not a single woman at the table. And I said, I think the company has an obligation to help its people grow, and particularly when we don't have any women in our executive staff. And you're going to give me 6 months to help her, to help work with her. And I didn't give a choice, and so they all agreed. And so I sat down with her, and we met, of course, every week. And I said, I sort of almost literally explained to her the situation. I said, we're in a pretty tough situation. I didn't give her all the nitty-gritty details of who said what and how, but I made it clear that things were needing to change. And I told her I was committed to help her change. And I then started to tell her that one of her main problems is she's managing processes and not people. And there's a big difference. She was managing tasks and managing projects and overseeing, and I said, no, your job is to assign those projects to your staff and expect them to complete them. And if not, you have to go work with them to figure out why it's not happening. Your job is to help them figure out why they've got problems and help them fix their own problems. And I'm very happy to say that 6 months later, that all the squawking and all the complaining stopped, and no one, by the way, raised the subject and said, oh, she did a great job, or Eric, you did a good job. No one cared, but I never heard anyone else say again, we need to find someone to oversee her and manage her. And I have to say, her, and I did this, I won't tell you all the anecdotes, but I think what gave me the most pride is seeing my ability and interest in helping my staff grow. And many of them today are executives at other high-tech companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And I have to say that it never used to give me satisfaction, but that's what gives me a lot of satisfaction today, is seeing, and they're all friends. We all stay in touch, even though I'm living here, and I still get calls for references on their behalf from recruiters and whatever have you, and to help them in their careers. So you invest in them, and you help them develop their careers, and of course it's your job to motivate them and to keep them informed. You know, there were many times where I would stand in front of, my staff got to be as big as 200 people, and this was true at Apple and some other places, and there were times where somebody stood up and said, look, I can't tell you what's really going on. Here's what I can tell you, and I gave them limited degree, but there were rumors fluctuating by acquisitions or this division getting torn apart or reorgs happening, and there's always happening at companies, and there are times you can talk and there are times you can't, and I was just always trying to maintain a level of honesty, and that's another commitment you have. And when you enter and hire people, is you have a commitment to try to be honest with them. And sometimes that means you can't tell them things, and they have to know that as long as they know that there are times you can't do that, then I think things are fine. Obviously, you also have an opportunity, I think you have an obligation to employees to share in the upside. I think this is a problem I see here in Israel much more than the United States, and I hope this starts to change more. In startups, and I think that's most of what we're talking about living here in Tel Aviv, or some of you live in Tel Aviv. In the United States, among startups, there's generally a broader distribution of stock among employees than what I see happens here in Israel. There's a large concentration of stock here among the founders of the company, of course, and the investors get their share, and that's pretty much the same in both locations that I've seen. But much more stock gets distributed among current and future employees, and of course, the amount of stock should reflect the value of these people to the company, their roles in the company, when they entered, the risk at the time that they entered the company. But I think it's important for us leaders in the industry here to start trying to increase the opportunity of the upside for many of the employees. I mean, it's well known in the Valley, the stories are well known and talked about, that literally janitors working at Google made enough money to buy themselves beautiful homes in San Francisco. And of course, Google's happened, once every 10 years or so, but those stories are spread well enough that people know that they expect to share in the opportunity of the upside, and I think it's something that should happen more and more here. But that has a corollary, and that needs to be explained to employees. There are times in the life of a startup when things get hard, when expenses are too high to match the expense rate, and you need to reduce the expense rate in order to extend the cash flow to when you can get to the next milestone and perhaps raise more money or get to a profitability point. And I think it's important to explain to employees as you're hiring them, especially these early stages of companies, that there may be times when we need to work at reducing expenses. Obviously, everyone has a family and everyone has families to feed, and of course these things need to be taken into account as well. But I think it's important that if people are sharing in the upside, they also need to be thinking about what happens when things don't go right and things don't go well. And inevitably, in every startup, including Google, things didn't always go well, and there were problems when people had to cut back and so on. Because really the last thing you want to do is to cause someone to lose their job if it's not deserved. And I've had to do that twice in my life, and it's a terrible thing to do. It's not very pleasant. So I think I've talked about investors and shareholders. Ron came in late, so he knows investors don't matter. And then we talked about employees, and now the most important one is the customers. And the customers are the most important, and the most important entity you're having. I wouldn't say you're having a vow necessarily with them, but you have an obligation, and you have a certain commitment to them. I'll describe some forms of commitments. Let me talk about why first. Obviously, the most logical question is that they pay the bills. Ultimately, if you don't have customers, no one's buying anything. If no one's buying anything, you have no income, and you have no way you can afford to pay your company. And so that's that's the most important thing. But obviously, if you have customers and the customers are happy, they recommend your product, your service to their friends. Things get better, things spread out, and increases your customer base, and that's all really great. You hear companies use different words for this. At Apple, we like to use the word, we delight our customers. I use the word we because I'm still a shareholder. and that's what they genuinely believe that they do. And there were times in Apple's history where they didn't do that, but that's what they believe that their mission is, to delight their customers. Most people use this as customer satisfaction. You know, the J.D. Powers is a ranking, whatever have you. It's a way of keeping your customers satisfied and happy. And that's sort of why we do it. And we do it in different ways. You know, obviously, you know, if a sales guy goes in and he sells a large corporation on a large product or a large software product or hardware, it doesn't really matter. There's typically a contract. And there's a contractual obligation to your customers that you've engaged in, and your sales force is signing you up to the product will be available so much, you know, hours of the day, so many days of the week, or it'll meet certain performance criteria, or will save you so much money. Whatever it does, you're entering in certain. But that's a very direct vow and obligation you have with your customers. There are more indirect ones. So along that lines is most companies offer guarantees and warranties on their products that last a certain period of time. One more subtle one is brand. And it's often not emphasized. People think brand, let's create a flashy logo and a catchy title for the company, and that's what brand's about. But brand is actually, it's a small portion of what brand is about. There's a term you may or may not have heard of called defending the brand. And I think the best way for me to really impart to you the importance of this is to maybe tell a story. It's a real story. So I was working at Apple at the time. This was about 1989 or 90. And prior to Apple, I'd worked, at Xerox, and I'd worked at Saran. And I had been in the chip industry, okay, the semiconductor industry. That's the industry that's responsible for making the microchips that go into all these devices. In those days, it was, of course, the personal computer industry and the communications industry. And in that industry, people who made the microchips sold them to companies who often built the products that we knew by name, whether it was an AT&T telephone or whether it was a IBM computer or an Apple computer. No one really knew or cared whose chips those were inside the computers. Okay, no one knew or cared, and that's largely true today, until a small company that, believe it or not, was on the verge of going bankrupt at one point of its career, called Intel, came along, and it decided, no, we're going to create a brand. There were two guys. Some of you may have heard of an investment company called Moore Davidow, and Davidow was actually Jewish. Bill Davidow. He was an executive at Intel during this period, and a guy working for him was a guy named Dave Galatly. And the two of them came up with a program within Intel called Orange Crush. I don't know how they got the name. That was what it's called. And it was all about creating a brand image for Intel, which until that point really didn't have a brand image. People knew about the company because it was a very big, successful company. And not always, but at least this time it was. But Intel was intent on creating a brand. In part, it wanted to create a brand for itself because, believe it or not, it had a lot of competition at this time. There were maybe 6 different companies at that time making x86 chips, because Intel was forced by its contract with IBM to license the technology to multiple companies, and Intel had real competition, so it was looking for ways to distinguish itself in the market. So it came up with this brainchild called brand. We're going to create a brand. And they invested a lot of money, and of course we all know what today is the Intel Inside program. And we know the bong, bong, bong music and all the stupid stuff they require manufacturers to put on their personal computers and all this other nonsense. And they took it really seriously. Well, lo and behold, I think it was 1989, although I could be off by a year. There was a group of students, I think in the East Coast, I think it was one of the universities on the East Coast, I don't remember which one, who were doing some I was a faculty member at one of the universities on the East Coast. I think it was New York someplace. who found out that when they did a floating point operation, a certain kind of multiplication, that the Intel floating point processor came up with a wrong answer. And it hit the news. And I was at Apple at the time, and Intel's announcement after that first hit the wires was, it only affects 1 in 5 million operations that a person could possibly use, and it's really not an issue. And I just started laughing. And sure enough, over the next 3 or 4 days, there were articles after articles coming out trashing Intel like you wouldn't believe. IBM announced that it was going to offer anyone who had a problem that came to them that had bought an IBM computer with this faulty Intel processor, that they would actually fully fund a replacement if people would say that this was causing them a problem. And I think there was another company in the personal computer industry, maybe it was Compaq at the time, who announced the same thing. Why? Because these companies understood brand, and they understood what it meant to defend the brand, and Intel didn't have a clue. And it cost them a lot of money, because they basically, in the end, they had to have a program, they were forced to, by the industry, in the end, to have a replacement program where they basically offered anybody who had a problem could bring their motherboard back to us and we'll replace the motherboard. But it was too little too late. So after investing, I don't know how many millions in dollars in creating the Intel Inside brand, they managed to destroy it all in a matter of 24 hours. And then they had invested a lot more money afterwards to change that. So when you create a brand and you promote the brand among your customers, among the public, then you have to stand up and you're basically putting your company on the line and saying, we will just defend this brand. You remember the story with Apple. It was like, I think it was the Apple IV first came out. There was they called Antennagate. Remember this? People forget really quickly. They came out and people said if you hold it the wrong way, the signal strength is really bad. And then Steve Jobs, running probably the most brand conscious high-tech company in the world, stood up and said, it doesn't happen that often. and that lasted about 1 day. And then his PR department stepped in and actually talked. Remember they gave away bumper guards away for free for a while to other customers, anybody who wanted them, as a way of basically doing it. I think in the end they proved it really was a non-issue, but it doesn't matter. I think that's the other issue. It doesn't matter whether it's a real issue or a non-issue. If the perception among your customers and your employees that there's a problem, then there's a problem. It doesn't matter what the reality is. You've got to deal with it.
But the customer's always right.
So the message I'm trying to get across is indirectly a brand. When you create a brand and you promote the brand, you are in a way entering in I wouldn't say a contract, but an informal agreement with your employees about that you're standing behind that brand and behind your products, and therefore it's some kind of commitment or vow. I think let's see here. I think I have a couple more things to say, and then I'd like to stop, and hopefully other people have something to say besides me. I'd love to talk about the sales process a second, because ultimately, when you're dealing with customers, and customers are, of course, as I said, the most important contract you enter in or commitment you make is when you're running a company. You often have a sales force, and whether it's a direct sales force, an indirect sales force, you're just promoting on the internet, doesn't really matter. Sales forces tend to overpromise. It's just inherent in their nature, and it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to stop them. And in part, if it's running the company, sometimes you don't want to stop them because it's their job to generate the sales and the interest. And so you, as either the person running sales or the person working with sales or the person overseeing the person who's running sales, has to understand where you draw the lines and what you promise and don't promise customers, because it becomes a very gray area without any clear lines and delineations. And I won't say the customer's name, but when I was in Get There, I was asked, I had to sometimes go out with a sales force and sell the product. And we were in front of a very, very, very important and big customer. who was asking for some commitments from, they wanted to talk with the guy who's responsible for engineering, because that to them that was a guarantee that they needed to get from the product point of view. And there were certain features they wanted in the product. And I had actually stand up in front of it. It was like the only time I ever did it inside the company. I actually stood up, knowingly lied to this big company. I told them we would have these features available on this certain time frame, and I knew there was no way we could meet that time schedule at the time I made the promise. And I made the promise, and I pulled, and I think this, and I told the sales guy going in that this was happen. I was willing to do it, and this was why I was willing to do it, and this is what was going to be the consequences of doing it. Number one, I said this is not going to happen again. But I know if I don't do this, then I will have no company to come back to apologize when I miss the schedule, because they're not going to buy our product, they're going to go buy somebody else's. So this was the difference between making and not making the sale. I'm neither proud nor ashamed of what I did. It's something I did. And I think there'll be times in your careers and when your companies that you're running or will run one day that you'll have to make similar decisions. But I knew it because I knew we would be late, but I knew we would deliver it. And in fact, we delivered it, but we delivered it maybe it was a month or two late, and I actually did have to go back to the big company, and I apologized, and I told them all the things we were doing to fix it and why it was going to be delivered when we said it was going to be delivered, and we in fact delivered it on that second date I promised. But I knew if I hadn't promised that, we would not have gotten that sale, and someone else would have gotten it in our competition, and once you lose it, you can't get back in to try to get it back. And so I knowingly did that. And there will be times when your sales force will need to do that. And it's up to you to try to provide the guidance when they shouldn't do that. So with one last subject, I think I'll wrap up. And the last one, there is a fourth obligation I think leaders of companies have. Besides, I mentioned the first one is to our investors and shareholders, and our second one is our employees, the third one is our customers, and the last one is, I think, society, and the society in which we live in. And this is something I find a little more unique here than the United States. I think it's something hopefully that grows bigger here than I've seen in the past, but I see much more of it here than I see signs in the United States. In the United States, yes, there are many people who give money to nonprofits and charities of their choice. There are tax laws in the United States that encourage this, and they're very good laws, I think, because without them there would be many charities that wouldn't exist. And, those people who are searching for cures to cancer and heart disease and so on and so forth, those people building orphanage wouldn't have the funds to do the critical services they need to provide to society, to those parts of society that can't get served by a government. And of course, we have our share here in this country. But what happens in the United States is wealthy people who made money out of real estate or through high tech or through just normal corporations, after they've made a certain amount of money, they decide in their own lives, oh, it's time for me to start creating an endowment or creating a charitable trust fund or whatever and give back. And they make those decisions. Steve Jobs is a great example. During his entire life, there's no signs he gave any money to any charity whatsoever. But he has a huge endowment and a huge charitable, and he has a charitable trust that he and his wife established. And his wife is one of the biggest money givers in the United States today. And it's not known because she doesn't make a big deal out of it. She doesn't report it like Bill Gates or go on TV to talk about it. But they're giving almost their, I wouldn't say all their fortune, but a large portion of it back now. Okay? And he was criticized while he was alive for not doing that, by the way, because by many people in the public. And I see signs, and I think as a nation here in Israel, we've been used to getting money, and I'll use the word schnorring. It's a very popular word in Jerusalem in particular. That we're very good at asking for our compatriots in the United States to give us money for this, that, and elsewhere. And I think that we're getting to the stage as a society here where there are enough people with enough money that we can start donating ourselves. And I think I'm proud to say I'm a part of one organization that's doing it. There's something called the Israel Venture Network that's trying that. Yaron, through his funds, is doing that. There are one or two other investors in the country that are doing that, and I hope it spreads more and more to many other investors that are encouraging their entrepreneurs to start thinking and being inbred and and understanding that the government can't do everything. It's impossible. It's incapable of doing many things, most things, and for certainly not supporting a lot of the people in need in this country. And many of us citizens have to step up. Who, thank God we've been blessed in life with the ability to make a good income, and it's time for us to give back. And not only after we made the money, but during the course of making the money as well. And with that, I'll shut up.
Questions? Any comments or questions?
No one disagrees? I don't know.
I would disagree with that.
You made a comment earlier about the difference between shareholder value and what's good for customers, and that they're not always the same thing. You would assume that if things are good for customers are happy, they keep buying and they buy more. I mean, doing something for shareholder value that ends up hurting customers hurts the lifetime value of the company.
Okay, so let me qualify. I think smart investors, whether they be big or individual shareholders, know that the customer and what's good for the customer is ultimately the most important thing. Because if you create happy customers pay, and they pay more than unhappy customers. And paying customers is what leads to value creation. But there are shareholders in this world that could care less about customers. I gave you an example of Carl Icahn as an example. I'm proud to say that I'm the only person I know that was in a negotiation directly with Carl Icahn and hung up the phone on him during the middle of the conversation. Yeah, no, but in retrospect, it was looking back, it was right because it led to a success. It led to a good outcome, both for him and us, but it had to get done. And there are a lot of people there are investors out there. There are the so-called corporate raiders. They use the pretense that they're coming to the defense of the shareholders, okay? And excuse my term, I think it's bullshit. It's an excuse, and these people are evil and they're nefarious, and it's all about greed. The movie Wall Street with, it's all about greed. It has nothing to do with creating value. These people go around, they'll split up a company in 5 pieces thinking, maybe that's the right thing to do, by the way. Maybe the company needs to be broken apart, but they do it in a way to make profit for the shareholders, not for the benefit of the customers and the employees, which I think are the top priorities. You can't create a company purely for the benefit of employees, otherwise it's a charity. It's got to serve the customer. And if breaking up a company into smaller pieces ends up serving the customers better, then for sure it's the right thing to do. And there are many examples throughout history where that was the case. Many of the antitrust laws in the United States are designed for that purpose. And I think that they've been used, for the most part, successfully. I wish they get used here more successfully, okay? Because they're needed here more, to be. I think they exist on the books, but they're not. What's the right word? Enforced. They're not enforced properly, okay? And because they would be good for the customers, I mean, we shouldn't. I mean, I won't give examples. I think all of us know the examples here. So I think that's what I mean by the difference between shareholder and customer value, and they sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not the same. Generally, shareholders are happy when the company's making lots of money, but there are things that happen, and out of the control of the executives, out of the control of the customer space, whether it's a catastrophe or a new competitor or a new technology trend or something gets disintermediated, things just happen, and hopefully companies can respond. Hopefully, but not always.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sitkin, for whether we just get back to their works or not. But thank you everybody here for coming, and hope to see you again. Thank you, Dr. Sitkin, for moving to Israel and helping our nation. And hope to see you guys again.
Thank you for hosting. Thank you.
Adjourned. I do agree with your point, though, on people giving back. I think it's I'm talking to some funds here now. like I was just yesterday, one group is now requiring all the companies are investing to give a certain piece.
Right.
A small piece.
Yeah, we
No, I think it's a lot of this is coming because of the Tomorrow thing, and everyone saw the Waze,
I've
$1.5 million.
read about tomorrow in the next one.
But there's different,
No, I think we do with this one too. And I think it's because I don't think it's a lot of. And sometimes it can be a lot of money. You never know. But I think equally important.
as an investor, you don't want to give too much money away.
It just creates a certain mentality, especially when these young entrepreneurs. It's not all about them. It's not all about money. They know it's more than just money. It's exciting. They're
Oh, and also I think it just creates a different kind of corporate culture. Listen, I work in GE, but they put that aspect.
Yeah, that's why when it comes to corporate nationals,
Yeah, exactly. I get 50% match on all the charities they give to non-religious institutions. And you can prove enough that you think kind of outside of the religious institutions, we get a lot of things. It's incredibly important. When you go to startups, like I encourage companies to do team outings, do it as a volunteer day. Don't just like take them skiing and promote. Right? Do something that everyone kind of. Yeah, exactly. We used to do that a lot. I would appreciate the state before we're here. We haven't had it all the time. Right? And those kind of things. And it's important. Right? It gets people. It's good for the team. It's good for the mentality. It's good for kind of the culture of the company. Yeah. All right. Nice to see you again. Take care. See you next time.
Hi, Gary.
What's going on?
Yeah.
I just met with you. Told me.
You're going to say which one?
Yeah, I've been going back and forth to the States a lot. And then I was in Paris
But you were in the valley for a while.
working for it. I'm still working for it. My husband's still in the middle of his paperwork. So first he needs to get his paperwork, and then he needs to go over and
Like
So we have to get his green card. And,
yeah, very.
He started a consulting firm in New York, consulting for universities to build
LLC, the company over in the West.
alumni engagement
State
and
where
open
you can
presentations.
domicile, after domicile, then the green card, then.
Oh, you said
Same really.
And I'm hoping that LLCing the company and having the bank accounts will be enough. If it's not, then I'm gonna have to go and like
Oh, really?
over on my
Yeah,
own.
in Israel?
And
I
that's what
went
we
to
really
one
hard
space
with
for
the
really
kids.
expensive. They were
Yeah,
very
I know.
expensive though.
Believe me, I'm freaking out about it.
I don't know if it's his
We
favorite.
have to have people who can't do it. So that's going to be
financially,
kind
that's
of
what you
challenging.
want to do, because things are really expensive.
I'm in touch with, I was in Facebook with Meta.
In San Francisco.
We looked at it. There's some friends maybe.
Yeah, long
I
time.
don't know if you know Scheitzer.
You go back to New York?
Shy?
So we used to work at prison when he worked at Mexico. So we used to go into over to the valley now. And the neighborhood he lived in with another friend of ours, Dan Feld, who's now over. And they're putting under board.
You have kids in school?
Yeah. That's part of the reason why we want to go. Because they're able to